What I'd like What I'd like to talk with you about today are the events in German politics which take place from July 1932 through January of 1933. And there's a previous video, which you may have already seen, which goes through the events of 1930, 1931, and 1932. And there we left off having seen the stunning election results of July 1932. And I think that really to put 1932 in context, there are two things we want to remember that happened even before the election. The first of them happens at the end of May, when Hindenburg and Hitler have a conversation in which, in return for supporting von Papen's cabinet, Hitler gets the ban that Bruning placed on the SA lifted, and he gets the new elections of July. So those are the things that are agreed to. Hitler supports the von Papen cabinet, and then the elections occur. And so in July, the other key thing that happens is that there's a Nazi march in a communist area in Prussia, and this leads to fighting in the streets. 17 people are killed, and von Papen uses this as an excuse to essentially depose the democratically elected government of Prussia and to install a Reichsminister who's in charge of Prussia. So for those of you who live in federal republics, like the United States or Brazil, then you're familiar with the idea of there being a federal government, but then there also being state governments. And so this is the equivalent of the federal government taking over the management of a state. And this is highly irregular, almost certainly unconstitutional and illegal. And so this really undermines the idea of democracy in Weimar Germany. And it's especially damaging because Prussia represents such a large part of Germany, and at this point was controlled by the SPD, by the Socialist Party. And so they really lose their foothold on power here. And their options when confronted with this unconstitutional move are pretty limited. Because of the high unemployment of the Great Depression, a general strike really isn't going to be effective, and the idea of fighting in the streets against what would almost certainly be the army isn't very appealing either. So this is a very difficult situation for the socialists. They probably, in retrospect, many historians criticize the passiveness with which they deal with this, what is essentially like a coup d'etat, taking over Prussia from above. But even their best options were very bad. And that actually is going to end up being a pattern that we're going to see for, the rest of the Weimar Republic's history. The elections take place on the 31st, and we've already looked and we've seen the way in which the NSDAP rockets into power and becomes the largest party. And so, a key thing to kind of notice about these elections is that during these elections, we've really seen Hitler kind of downplaying some of the anti-Semitism. But he still is including in his speeches things that I think all of his supporters know what he's talking about. So when he's talking about, a poisonous scum that needs to be eliminated, all of his supporters know him well enough to know that he's talking about Jews, but he doesn't come out and say it. So this is a change for Hitler. So we see him almost trying to come to like a middle road of respectability. He's obviously trying to act as though he, believes in at least the Constitution and in the idea of law and order in general. It seems to Hitler and to the Nazis that after this election in July, that early in August, Hitler will be invited to become chancellor. He's the leader of the largest party. That would be natural. But Hindenburg ends up refusing to give him the top job and offers him the position of vice chancellor instead. Hindenburg has reservations that giving Hitler the position of chancellor is going to end up undermining the Constitution and lead to like a single-party dictatorship. On the other hand, Hindenburg and those around him well, maybe not against the entire Constitution, are very interested in assembling a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag to alter the Constitution. And in fact, they tried to do this before during the presidential election, when they wanted to have it changed so that Hindenburg wouldn't have to run. He could just be, his term could just be extended. But that would have required a change of the Weimar Constitution. There wasn't a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag for it because the Nazis refused. And the SPD wasn't going to go along with that necessarily. So it wasn't, although perhaps they could have been convinced given the alternative, which of course was Hitler running for president. But Hitler isn't elected. And but this changing of the Constitution is going to be the key goal that I think we have to keep in mind when we think about Hindenburg and the circle around him and Schleicher and even von Papen, that their goal is to somehow assemble a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. And to do this, they have to now, after July, they're going to have to include the NSDAP. There's no way to have a 2/3 majority, even if you had everybody else. You can't change the Constitution without the Nazis. But Hitler adopts kind of an all or nothing approach. Either I'm chancellor or I'm not participating in the government. And so that happens on the 13th. Meanwhile, even before that, there's been a big rise in political violence, especially perpetrated by the Nazis. And von Papen believes that this is kind of getting out of hand. So he gets an emergency decree passed, which states that any murder, manslaughter, any killing which takes place for political motives will receive the death penalty. And within 24 hours of this emergency decree being passed and going into action, there's an incident in a place called Potempa. And so some people call it the Potempa Incident, where a number of Nazis go and find kind of a communist, a KPD sympathizer, drag him out of his house and kick him to death in front of his brother and in front of his mother. It's very easy to identify these Nazis. They're arrested. They're brought to a special court. And they are, I think 5 of them are sentenced to death. And Hitler immediately comes out against this and in full support of them. So we have this interesting moment where right after this big electoral triumph where Hitler kind of toned down some of his most extreme views, we have him really coming out on the side of armed violence in the streets and really against legality. So this leads to, well, some historians have described this as the mask falling off of Hitler. His mask of legality is beginning to slip. The Reichstag, without the Nazi support, is not going to be helpful for von Papen. And so his plan is simply to dismiss the Reichstag and then delay calling elections, perhaps even delay calling elections unconstitutionally. But as the head of the largest party in the Reichstag, the NSDAP is able to elect the president of the Reichstag, who ends up being Hermann Goering, the number 2 man in the Nazi party, the World War I flying ace. And as president of the Reichstag, he's able to recognize people to speak. So on the 12th of September, von Papen comes in with a folder which is going to dismiss the Reichstag and end it immediately. But Goering refuses to recognize him. He pretends that he doesn't see him. And instead, what goes forth is what's called a vote of no confidence, where the members of the Reichstag vote if they have confidence in the government. And 512 members of the Reichstag, which is more than 90% of the Reichstag, vote that they have no confidence in von Papen as a leader. And even though von Papen can claim, well, actually the Reichstag was dissolved before this vote of no confidence, it has no impact, and even though he didn't need to have the mandate of the entire Reichstag, or even a majority of the Reichstag, because he's really ruling under presidential decree, this is simply too embarrassing. And so instead, the plan is to call new elections for two months from now, for November 6th. And so now the Nazis have to gear up for what is really now their third election campaign. I mean, it's the third election campaign for everybody, but the Nazi Party is clearly exhausted here. Hitler again does his airplane tour all over, but by the time of November 1932, for our first time now, the Nazi vote slips. It slips from 37% down to 33%. The SPD also loses a little bit. It goes from 22% to 20%. The Communist Party increases, essentially, you can almost think of it as stealing some of those socialist votes because it increases up to 17% from 14%. The Center Party holds steady, and the DNVP picks up some votes, probably votes from the Nazis. Turnout in general is lower. It's about 4% lower, down to about 80% of the population is voting. And that probably also hurt the Nazis as well. But the big headline is the Nazis received 2 million fewer votes in November than they received in July. And so if we think about 1932, it has this high mark for the Nazis in July of 1931. But after that, almost everything starts to go badly for them. Hitler's not given the chancellorship. They're left out of any sort of a coalition government because Hitler takes this all or nothing strategy. And now in November, their hand is really definitely weakened. These elections, again, make the NSDAP the largest party. And so again, Hindenburg, who's interested in changing the constitution, would like to somehow get Hitler on board. And so this time, Hindenburg and those around him offer to make Hitler chancellor. But they won't extend to him the emergency powers decree. So the president won't rule by decree. So Hitler would have to govern, as previous chancellors did up until 1930, by assembling a coalition government. And for him, his coalition would probably, could include the Center Party and the DNVP. That would give him about 55% of the seats in the Reichstag, and he would be able to rule there. So they wouldn't need to include the socialists. But he wouldn't have these emergency powers, and he'd have to compromise, and his cabinet would be made up of, a coalition of these parties. And Hitler turns this down again. He turns down the conditional chancellorship. And this really is too much for some members of the Nazi Party who are really concerned about this all or nothing strategy. And the biggest one of these is the man who's been working with Hitler throughout the 1920s to really build up the party and who really kind of led the party when Hitler was in prison, Gregor Strasser. And Strasser says, look, we can join a coalition and do this legally. Or we can do a march on Berlin, like they did in Italy. But this middle of the road, all or nothing, you either have to give me all, that's never going to happen. And so he ends up breaking from Hitler, and he ends up resigning from the party. And there's some suggestion that he is negotiating with Kurt von Schleicher, the general who's kind of the connection with Hindenburg, to maybe join a coalition government, and maybe he could be vice chancellor, and then that would split the Nazi party, and Hitler would be left out, but they would still have some NSDAP support. It's not clear if that meeting takes place in November. The only evidence we have for that is Goebbels in a book that he writes subsequently, and certainly if we look at the values and limitations of a posthumously written diary by Goebbels, there are some real limitations in terms of his credibility. We also have Goebbels' contemporary diary in which he doesn't mention this, so it seems like it might have been made up after the fact. Nevertheless, later, in December and January, Strasser is going to be offered this position. So the exact, and we do know that, so the exact timing of this might not be incredibly significant for our understanding. Hindenburg still wants von Papen to try to do it again and to form up a cabinet. But von Papen's cabinet themselves kind of disagree with this. And Kurt von Schleicher brings in a general to meet with the cabinet. And essentially at this point, the general of the army has done a study, and he says that the army is no longer in a position to guarantee to defend Germany's borders and to prevent a civil war at home. This really, really terrifies people. And so von Papen decides in this sense, without even the support of his own cabinet, he's not going to be able to seek to be a chancellor. And so Schleicher then gets to form a cabinet. And Schleicher forms a cabinet at the beginning of December. So we went with Bruning, that handed off to von Papen, and then we have Kurt von Schleicher, who's been kind of the man almost pulling the strings for Hindenburg behind the scenes, now actually having his own cabinet. But he runs into the exact same problem that would have happened to von Papen, which is he doesn't even have the support of even a strong minority in the Reichstag. So not going to be able to change the constitution, not going to be able to deal with this. And now he's really separated himself from von Papen, who's still very close with Hindenburg. So in December and January of 1933, we start to see this interesting situation where, on the one hand, the Nazi Party has definitely reached its peak and its vote total seems to be dropping. There are even some local elections in December, which seem to suggest that the Nazi vote total might be even less than 33% if there were subsequent elections to be held. So, and Hitler's not even necessarily acting like he's trying to generate a stronger vote total. I mean, he's certainly campaigning really hard, but in November, all the anti-Semitism is back, and he is he's given up his stance on legality because he's supported these Potempa murderers of the communists, and he's not even moderating his message anymore. So this is the sort of thing that Strasser was really frustrated about, where he feels like we don't even seem to be trying to achieve our goals. But at the same time that we have the Nazi total falling, we have this power struggle happening among Hindenburg's closest associates. And we have von Papen and Schleicher essentially competing for power. And this is where von Papen enters, and he hits upon the idea of somehow incorporating Hitler into a cabinet, which he will also be in, and that will push Schleicher out. And so he ultimately, in negotiations with Hindenburg and in consultation with Hindenburg the president, Hindenburg the leader of the large DNVP, the Nationalist Party, which has about 8% of the seats in the Reichstag, but is the most influential nationalist party after the Nazis. He ends up coming up with this idea of making Hitler chancellor and then offering him just a few cabinet positions and really having the cabinet be focused around Hindenburg and von Papen and their close associates. So this is the plan. And Hitler insists that the cabinet positions that he gets are control over Prussia, because now there's a Prussian cabinet minister since von Papen eliminated the local government, and that he gets the Interior Ministry. Hindenburg ends up objecting to this, so all that's actually offered is the Ministry of the Interior in Prussia and the Ministry of the Interior in Germany. And this doesn't seem like much. These are only 2 cabinet positions, and then Hitler is chancellor. But Hitler and the Nazis are gambling that if they're able to achieve power, and if they control the interior of Prussia and the interior of Germany, they'll control the police. And that having Hitler on top and control of the police, combined with a promise that once Hitler becomes chancellor, there can be another round of elections, which are going to end up taking place in March, that they will be able to finally accomplish their majority and they will be able to rule without any compromise. And so, at the end of January, on the 30th of January, Hitler is asked to be chancellor by Hindenburg, the president, who has always been against this, believes that this will lead to single-party rule, but he sees no way forward if the constitution is going to be changed. And Hitler becomes chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January. I think the key points here to remember are that Hindenburg and those around him will need a 2/3 majority, and that's what makes Hitler and the Nazis essential to their plans, and that's what makes them willing to work with Hitler and the Nazis. There should have been no doubt about what the Nazis would do if they came to power. They are not pretending by November. They're not even hiding their anti-Semitism. Hitler's speeches are very clear about this, and Hindenburg himself has his secretary draft letters to Hitler in November telling him that if he were to put him into power, it would lead to a single-party dictatorship, and he cannot in good conscience do that. November and December should have, or could have, been the end of the Nazi Party's ascendancy, and they could have lost their mandate to form a government. But this infighting that happens between Schleicher and von Papen ends up being what puts Hitler into power. So we have a clear case here where it's not elections that put the Nazi Führer into power in Germany in January 30th, 1933. It is the consent of elites who believe that they can use Hitler for their own purposes. And this is the key thing that puts Hitler into power on January 30th, 1933.